to the courthouse now on University Avenue. The jury there continues deliberations for a third straight day in the Jacob Hoggard sexual assault trial. The musician is accused of raping a 16-year-old girl and a young woman in his Toronto hotel in 2016. The defense argued the encounters were consensual. Hoggard pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of sexual assault causing bodily harm and 1 count of sexual interference. We want to get more now on what the jury will be focused on. We've had some indication. There have been a couple of questions for the judge. Criminal defense lawyer Joseph Neuberger joins us live now for some more analysis. Joseph, thanks so much for joining us. Okay, what do you take away from the questions that have been asked so far by this jury, and this being the third day of deliberations? It must be hard as a lawyer in any case, but a case like this in particular, to not read into that somewhat.
Yeah, when you're waiting for a jury verdict, you read too much into the questions from a jury, and you start to go through all sorts of scenarios. But the questions from the juries or from the jury members is pretty much in line with what you would typically have in a case. So they wanted a read back on some evidence and to hear the recording that was put into evidence, because there's 2 complainants. The issues are very serious, and they want to review the evidence to make determinations of fact. So that can take some time. Here we have 2 complainants, and it was important, as I said before, for Mr. Hoggard to testify. So they have to go through his evidence as well. So I think probably today they have a fairly good handle on what came out as the evidence in the case. Now they're probably going to be debating more about whether, the Crown has established non-consent in both instances beyond a reasonable doubt, and then they'll look at the sexual interference. That may be more of a secondary issue, but I think the main thrust of them is to determine, based upon all of the evidence that they have now, has the Crown established beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no consent to both of those encounters with those 2 young ladies.
Let's talk about the evidence that has been presented in this trial, because, in these types of cases, it's whose version of events you believe most. Who do you think, maybe I'll ask this. What was the strongest piece of evidence for the defense, and what was the strongest piece of evidence for the Crown prosecutors in this case, in your opinion?
Well, let's start with the Crown. So certainly you had 2 complainants testify who I thought their evidence in chief with the Crown was quite compelling. They were composed, they answered questions, they got their evidence out in a generally straightforward manner, and the core of their evidence seemed consistent with other evidence. For example, we heard witnesses who were friends of one of the complainant about what her demeanor was after the encounter, and that she was all shaken up. So there was consistency in the evidence, and in general what I'd call cohesion in the evidence. Cross-examination raised a number of interesting facts. There was some issues with respect to how one of the complainants said, she didn't have her cell phone, but it was accessible and she could have left and she didn't. And there was the issue, of course, with the complainant who had complained that she needed stitches. And so that type of an exaggeration is an issue. And I think the recording can go both ways. There was clearly some sort of an indication between the 2 of them that there was a complaint about how Mr. Hoggard behaved, but there's evidence of him saying that he thought the encounter was completely consensual. The other factor, I think, which is important here, is you're dealing with somebody who was a significant singer of notoriety in Canada. It's not unusual for these people to have lots of women interested in them. These 2 made arrangements to come down to Toronto to meet with Mr. Hoggard. So that has to factor into the mix as well, that clearly there were conversations to have intimate encounters with him, and there was an agreement in that fact. And then how did that change? When did that change? So I think Mr. Hoggard's evidence was straightforward, and that also is something they have to consider.
What about credibility? You mentioned some of, the stories from the accusers on the stand, but also, credibility was brought up in terms of Jacob Hoggard lying to his now wife, who was his girlfriend at the time of at least one of the encounters, about his relationships out of their relationship. Is credibility at all on trial here? How does that factor into a decision that the jury makes here?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So the central focus of any of these types of cases is credibility and reliability, but particularly credibility. Is there any evidence to undermine the veracity or the truth of what these people are saying. So when we review Mr. Hoggard's evidence, look, it can cut both ways. I think I said before in an interview, it's kind of low-hanging fruit because, again, this was a singer with notoriety who is having a number of encounters across Ontario, Canada, and this is just the way he operated at that time. And so he was young, maybe immature, and this is the way he behaved. So he readily admitted that he made comments that weren't true. He, lied to his then girlfriend. He said things to the complainants like, I love you, or there's going to be an ongoing relationship. These were obvious things that he had to admit, and it may enhance his credibility. I don't necessarily think that is a deterrent in his evidence, because it's truthful that he made, he said these things and they were not true. That doesn't change necessarily that at the time when he is meeting these young ladies separately, that there was not consent to the sexual activity. Just because he lied about these things does not mean that there was no consent. And again, you have to remember, it's the Crown who has the burden, and the judge instructed the jury particularly how to assess credibility.
Okay, Joseph Neuberger, great to have you on with analysis on this case as the jury continues to deliberate. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Take care.